The envelope wasn't sealed. That was the first thing Leonard noticed when the attorney slid it across the table. No glue on the flap, no nothing. Like whoever had prepared it already knew what was inside didn't need protecting. Like it had already done its damage. He was 63 years old. He'd done 2 tours in Vietnam, 1 in the Gulf. He'd buried his wife, Connie, 11 years ago on a Tuesday in March when the ground was still half frozen and the gravediggers had to work an extra hour. He'd raised his son, Preston, more or less alone after that, working nights at the grain elevator outside Harwick, Indiana, coming home with his hands cracked and his back bent, making sure there was always something hot on the stove, and clean clothes folded on the kitchen chair. He thought he'd seen every kind of hard there was. He hadn't seen this yet. The attorney, a thin man named Gerald Finch who wore his suit like it had been tailored for someone else, folded his hands on the desk and cleared his throat. Around the table sat Preston, 41 now, with his wife Meredith and her brother Cole and their family attorney, and a woman Leonard didn't recognize who turned out to be an appraiser. They'd all come for the reading of his brother's will. Lawrence had died 6 weeks ago. A stroke, quick, the doctors said he probably never felt it, and left behind what the obituary called a distinguished career in commercial real estate and civic philanthropy. What he'd actually left behind was a mess. But Leonard didn't know that part yet. The envelope had his name on it. Just Leonard. No last name. In Lawrence's handwriting, the L looping wide the way it always did. The way their mother used to correct him for when they were boys. He picked it up. The flap lifted open on its own. Inside was a single key on a plain ring, no tag, no label, and a piece of paper folded in thirds with 3 sentences written on it. You were always the better man. I knew it and chose wrong anyway. The marina on Kelsey Lake. The deed is in the name you'll recognize. Leonard read it twice. Then he set it face down on the table. Gerald Finch was already distributing the formal documents. Lawrence's estate, the downtown properties, the investment accounts, the vacation home in Hilton Head, was to be divided primarily between 2 charitable foundations Lawrence had named as co-beneficiaries, with a modest cash bequest to Preston as Lawrence's nephew, and a smaller sum to an employee named Cynthia Draker, who had apparently been his personal assistant for 19 years. Leonard got the key. Preston laughed, not loudly, more like air escaping. He looked at Meredith, and Meredith pressed her lips together the way she did when she was working to keep something polite. And Cole, who had never once in his life said a kind word to Leonard, leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, fitting, I guess." Leonard put the key in his shirt pocket. He thanked Gerald Finch for his time. He shook nobody's hand because nobody offered theirs. He walked outside into the October air. His truck was parked at the meter. In the back seat, an old yellow Labrador named Boone lifted his head, saw Leonard, and put it back down. Boone was 10. He moved slower than he used to. But he still always waited. Leonard sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine. Kelsey Lake was 40 minutes north. He'd fished there as a boy. He and Lawrence both had. Before Lawrence decided fishing was something that kept you poor, and real estate was something that made you rich. And the 2 of them had split along that line like wood along a grain and never fully come back together. Connie used to say it wasn't about money. It was about shame, that Lawrence was ashamed of where they'd come from. And Leonard's presence was a reminder. Leonard had never known what to do with that explanation, so he'd done nothing with it. He started the engine. He didn't tell Preston where he was going. Preston hadn't asked. Kelsey Lake sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridgelines, the water dark green in October, the trees along the bank stripped down to their bones. Leonard drove the county road along the western shore until he saw the sign. Kelsey Marina, private. The gate was padlocked with a chain. He sat for a moment, looking through the windshield. Then he reached into his shirt pocket. The key fit, the chain fell. Boone scrambled to his feet in the back seat. The marina was small. 6 boat slips, a weathered dock, a storage building with cedar shake siding gone gray, and a low office structure with a covered porch facing the water. Leonard walked the docks slowly. One board near the end was soft, and he stepped around it out of habit, like he'd walked this dock before, though he was sure he hadn't. The storage building was padlocked too. The same key opened it. Inside were tools, life vests, 2 aluminum canoes, and a filing cabinet, the old green metal kind that weighed as much as a truck engine. The top drawer was locked. The same key. He didn't open it right then. He sat on an overturned bucket with Boone pressing against his knee and looked out through the open door at the water, which was doing what water does in October. Just sitting there, gray and patient, like it had been there for a long time and intended to keep at it. He was trying to think about what Lawrence had meant and what he'd meant by the name you'll recognize, and why he'd had this place and never mentioned it once in 30-some years of occasional, awkward holiday phone calls and funerals. Boone put his head on Leonard's thigh. "Okay," Leonard said. He opened the filing cabinet. The deed was on top. The property was listed under the name Harwick Veterans Fellowship, LLC, which Leonard did not immediately recognize until he did. Because he had signed that paperwork himself in 1987 at a VFW meeting in the basement of St. Agatha's Church, when a group of them had incorporated a small fund to help veterans in the county who were struggling. They'd raised a little money, done some good for a few years. Then the founding members had aged and scattered, and the thing had quietly dissolved. Or he'd assumed it dissolved. Apparently Lawrence had continued making contributions to the LLC. For 37 years. He'd used it to purchase this property in 1994. He'd paid taxes on it, maintained the insurance, renewed the documentation every year in the spring. Leonard found the folders, 1 per year, in the drawer beneath the deed. 37 folders, each one with the receipts paper-clipped in the upper left corner, the way their mother had taught them both to file things. The appraisal on the cover of the 2025 folder was dated 8 months before Lawrence died. The marina and surrounding 12 acres, with lakefront access and existing structures, was valued at $2.8 million. Leonard sat back on the bucket. Boone looked up. "I know," Leonard said. Flipped to the back of the folder. There was a letter there, on plain white paper, handwritten in Lawrence's looping script. "Leonard, I should have told you this years ago. I should have done a lot of things years ago. When Father passed and I took over the business accounts, there was money in the Harwick Fellowship Fund that I told you had been dispersed. It hadn't been. I used it instead. I told myself I would pay it back. And eventually I paid it back and then more. And eventually I didn't want to explain any of it, so I just kept going. This property is what that money grew into. It belongs to the fellowship. Which means it belongs to you since you were the one who actually believed in what you were doing. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not asking for it. I'm just telling you the truth now because I'm running out of time to do it, and I don't want to go without having done it at least once. Connie would have known what to say. She always did. I was sorry when she passed. I was too small to say so." "Your brother," Lawrence Leonard folded the letter. He put it in his shirt pocket with the key. He sat for a long time looking at the water and not doing anything, just breathing and letting Boone lean against his leg. And somewhere on the far bank a heron lifted off and crossed low over the water and disappeared into the trees. He called Gerald Finch the next morning from the porch of the marina, with a cup of coffee he'd made on the camp stove. He kept behind the truck seat. Finch already knew about the property. Lawrence had discussed it with him in the final months. Finch had prepared a transfer document and held it pending the will's execution. Leonard was the named beneficiary of Harwick Veterans Fellowship, LLC in full, sole managing member with complete authority over the entity and its assets. "Your brother was clear," Finch said. "He wanted it to be yours to do with as you chose." "Did my son know about this?" There was a pause. The estate was disclosed to all interested parties in the formal filing. The fellowship asset was listed. So Preston had known, and Cole, and Meredith. They'd all sat in that room and watched Leonard pick up a key in an envelope and laughed their quiet, polished laugh, and they'd known there was $2.8 million in property attached to it. Leonard drank his coffee and looked at the lake. "Mr. Harwick," Finch said carefully, "if you're wondering why they didn't say anything—" "I'm not wondering," Leonard said. "I know why." He thanked the attorney and ended the call. Boone came around the corner of the building with something in his mouth. A tennis ball he'd found somewhere, one of those fuzzy green ones half chewed and gray with age. He dropped it at Leonard's feet and looked up with that particular lab expression that has no shadow of irony or cruelty in it, only the pure and embarrassing hopefulness of a creature that believes this moment, right here, might be the best one yet. Leonard picked up the ball and threw it toward the dock. Boone ran. Preston called that evening. Leonard was inside the office structure, which turned out to have a cot, a wood stove, and a small bathroom. Lawrence, apparently, had spent time here, and Leonard had swept it out and gotten the stove going and was eating crackers and peanut butter when his phone rang. "Dad." Preston's voice had that careful quality, the one he used when he was negotiating. Leonard had heard it at Connie's funeral and at every difficult conversation since. "I think we should talk about the marina." "All right, there are options. Finch says the lakefront property market up in that corridor has been active. There are buyers, good buyers. If you wanted to liquidate, you could walk away with close to $3 million, maybe more, depending on how you structured it, and, I mean, you're 63, Dad. That kind of money, set up correctly, you'd never work again. You could, I don't know, travel, rest, a pause. You've earned it." Leonard looked at Boone, who had found a spot near the wood stove and was studying the warmth with the dedicated focus of an animal who has decided this is exactly where he's supposed to be. "I appreciate you calling," Leonard said. "Dad, I'll let you know what I decide." He set the phone face down on the cot. He didn't sleep well that night, not because of Preston, or the money, or the letter in his shirt pocket. He didn't sleep well because he kept thinking about a man named Teddy Briard, who had done 3 years in Fallujah and come home to find there was nothing waiting for him in the way of understanding or structure, or a single person who could help him talk about what he'd seen, and who had died in a VA waiting room in 2019, at the age of 44, still waiting for his appointment. Leonard had driven 4 hours to that funeral. He'd stood in the back because he hadn't known the family well enough to sit up front. He'd driven home alone. He'd been thinking about Teddy Briard for 5 years and hadn't known what to do with the thinking. He was starting to know. He spent 3 weeks at the marina before he drove back to Harwick. In that time, he walked every foot of the 12 acres, which included a meadow behind the storage building and a wooded ridge above it with a view of the lake. He made calls, some to old contacts from the VFW, some to a woman named Patricia Sowell at the Indiana Department of Veterans Affairs, who had been working in veteran services for 20 years, and who, when Leonard explained what he was thinking, went quiet for a long moment and then said, "Tell me more." What Leonard was thinking was this: the property was too good to sell, and too good to sit empty. There was room for 4 or 5 small cabins on the meadow. The storage building could be converted to a common space. Meals, meetings, whatever was needed. The dock and the lake and the silence and the trees were worth something that didn't have a dollar value. Something that had to do with a man being able to sit somewhere and breathe without performing okayness for anyone. He was thinking about a retreat. For veterans. Specifically for veterans coming out of treatment programs or crisis situations. Men and women who needed somewhere stable and peaceful and real for 30 days or 60 days. Somewhere with a dog around. Somewhere where nobody was going to ask them how they were doing in that particular tone of voice that means please say fine. Patricia Sowell connected him with a nonprofit attorney. The nonprofit attorney connected him with a contractor who specialized in accessible construction. Leonard drove back to Harwick, sold his house in 60 days, which he'd been meaning to do for 4 years, ever since his knees made the stairs a negotiation, and put the equity toward the construction fund. He called Gerald Finch and told him the property would not be sold. He did not call Preston. Preston called him in January, 3 months later, from what sounded like a restaurant. "I heard you hired a crew," he said. "Word gets around, Dad. You're spending the equity from your house on, what is this exactly? A charity. It's a facility for veterans in transition. You're 63 years old. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." Leonard was standing outside the marina office in the cold, watching two of the crew members frame out the first cabin wall, the sound of nail guns carrying across the meadow. Boone was sitting at his feet watching the crew with the focused, benevolent supervision of an animal who considers himself relevant to all nearby operations. "Preston," Leonard said, "I know you thought I'd sell. I understand why you thought that. But this is what I'm doing." A long pause. Cole can think what he likes." Another pause. Then, quieter. "Are you okay, Dad? I mean, really?" Leonard thought about that. "Better than I've been in a while," he said. Yeah, he wasn't performing okayness. It was just true. The first cabin was finished in April, the second in June. By August, they had 3 cabins, the converted common space, a small dock addition with a covered seating area, and a vegetable garden that one of the early residents, a man named Arthur who'd done 20 years in the Marines and had a talent for growing things, had planted along the south side of the building and was tending with an intensity that suggested the tomatoes were his current mission objective. The facility took its first residents in May. 4 veterans, 3 men and a woman, each of them referred through the VA network Patricia Soule had helped Leonard navigate. There were rules, not punitive ones, just structure. Morning meeting, shared meals, individual quiet time in the afternoons. 2 dogs lived at the property now. Boone, still elderly and devoted, and a younger shepherd mix named Sergeant that one of the residents had brought and then been unable to take when his situation changed. Sergeant stayed. He was fast and attentive and deeply concerned about the perimeter, which he patrolled at intervals that would have impressed a base commander. Cole came in July with a journalist friend who wanted to write something for the regional paper. Leonard wasn't sure how he felt about that, but Patricia said the visibility would help with the next round of grant applications, so he said yes. Cole stood on the dock in his city clothes, looking at the lake, and didn't say much. At the end, when the journalist had gone to photograph the garden, Cole stood next to Leonard and said, without looking at him, "I didn't think you'd actually do it." Leonard watched a loon cross the far end of the lake. "I know," he said. "For what it's worth," Cole said, and then stopped and didn't finish, and Leonard didn't push him to. It was worth something, not everything, but something. The article ran in September under the headline, "A Veteran's Vision." How a 2 a.m. surprise became a lifeline for those who served. It got picked up by 2 regional outlets and then by a veterans advocacy organization that shared it nationally. Within 3 weeks, Leonard had 47 emails from veterans or their families, 11 from donors, and 1 from a woman in Oregon named Susan, who turned out to be the daughter of a man Leonard had served with in Vietnam, and who had been trying to find Lawrence's executor to ask about a letter Lawrence had sent her father's family years ago. That took some untangling. But it got untangled. By the end of the year, the fellowship had a board of directors, a second-year operating budget, a waiting list of 12 veterans, and a formal partnership with the VA referral network. Patricia Soule joined the board as chair. The contractor came back to frame out a 4th cabin before the first snow fell. Preston drove up in November. He came alone, without Meredith, and Leonard suspected that meant something, but he didn't ask. They walked the property together in the gray afternoon light. The meadow, the ridge, the dock, with Boone moving slowly between them and Sergeant ranging out ahead. Leonard showed him the common space. The garden plot covered now in mulch, for winter the framed photos on the wall. Teddy Breard's was up there, alongside 7 others Leonard had known or known of. Men and women who hadn't made it to something like this in time. Preston stood in front of them for a while without saying anything. "I should have called more," he said finally. He wasn't talking to Leonard specifically. He was talking to the wall, or to himself, or to no one in particular. But Leonard heard it. "You're here now," Leonard said. They had dinner at the common table with 3 of the current residents. Arthur, who talked at length about his spring planting plans, a quiet man named Dennis, who rarely said much but always laughed at the right moments, and a young woman named Kira who had 2 years out of the army and a fierceness about her that reminded Leonard of Connie, which he did not say aloud because he knew better. Preston stayed 2 nights. When he left, he shook Leonard's hand in the parking area beside the truck, which they hadn't done in years. They'd been cheek kisses and backpats for a while, the hollow kind. This was different. Preston held on for a moment and then let go. "I'll come back in the spring," he said. If it'd be useful. We could use someone who knows how to lay drainage pipe," Leonard said. "You used to be decent at that." Preston almost smiled. "I was better than decent." "You were adequate," Leonard said. Preston got in his car. Leonard watched him go down the county road until the taillights disappeared around the bend. Boone was sitting beside him. The old dog leaned gently against his leg, which he'd always done. A small, steady pressure that said, "I'm here. I'm still here." "I know, buddy," Leonard said. The lake was dark and still. The November sky had that clean, stripped quality to it, like everything unnecessary had been blown away, and only the true things were left. Stars were coming out over the ridge. The air smelled of pine and of the wood smoke from the common space where someone had gotten the fire going early tonight. Leonard stood there long enough to feel the cold settle in, then turned and walked back toward the light. In his shirt pocket, where he'd carried it every day since October, was the key on its plain ring. He'd thought about putting it in the filing cabinet, or framing it, or doing something deliberate with it. But he hadn't. It had just stayed where it was, in his pocket, every morning when he got dressed. A small weight, a small reminder that the things that change your life don't always announce themselves, and the people you think you've lost track of are sometimes watching from further off than you knew. And sometimes they find a way, in the end, to say what they should have said. He didn't know if that was forgiveness. He wasn't sure he needed to name it. He walked inside. Someone had left coffee on. Sergeant came padding down the hall and sat down in front of him, and looked up with that direct, uncomplicated attention that dogs have. Full presence, no performance, no agenda. Leonard scratched behind the shepherd's ears. "All right," he said. "Let's see what the evening's got."